Good evening, everyone. I am Becky Pringle. I am the president of the National Education Association. I am so grateful that you have joined us here this evening. We have a lot to talk about. We have done some incredible work over this last year, but honestly, over the years that span our collective um, journey throughout education, our members and our affiliates and activists that are in the space with us this evening have established a path forward to address the inequities and the long-standing unmet needs of our students with special needs. Most of us believe that every child, every student, no matter their color or zip code, no matter their abilities, every student has the right to an education in a nurturing and supportive environment, with all students, all of them, having equitable access to high quality learning experiences. We know that COVID-19 revealed and exacerbated inequities that educators have seen in schools for forever. The students who were already stranded in the digital divide, the students who were already hungry, the students who had no place to call home, the students who were differently abled. We also know more than 1 out of 10 students is a student with a disability. And we know that number is on the rise. These students have been deeply affected by this pandemic. Despite the best efforts of educators and their parents, the continuity of learning has been disrupted, and their emotional, mental, and physical health has been impacted. The pandemic left far too many of our students with disabilities without access to the services and supports they need to thrive. While the switch to remote learning has been challenging for all of our students and all of our educators, certainly, and our parents too, our students with disabilities, and particularly our students of color, have been especially hard hit. They are the least likely to have effective access to remote instruction. They are most likely to need in-person supports that were not provided during the pandemic. And they are most likely to have lost a family member or friend because of the pandemic. Those losses compounded the pre-existing opportunity gaps that have been caused by the systemic underfunding of programs for both special education and disabled students, and the deep racial disparities and injustices that far too many of our students have suffered at the hands of, and provided special education and disabled students. Um, uh, they've not been provided the kind of services that we know they need and they so deserve. Compounding these issues is new research that informs us that we have additional concerns to address for this vulnerable population, especially students of color with disabilities, that are related directly to the disproportionate exclusionary discipline practices and policies that exist in far too many of our schools. As we meet this moment, our work is more critical than ever. We must be compelled to work even harder to create equitable opportunities and outcomes for our most vulnerable students. Tonight, we will hear from voices across our affiliates about how the pandemic and underfunding for generations has impacted our students and educators, and most importantly, what our path forward must be to address those inequities. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us this evening to lend your educator and parent voices, your professional expertise to our conversation. Joining us tonight, we have Noelle Candelaria, a special education teacher and former paraprofessional from El Paso, Texas. Noelle is now serving as the secretary of the National Education Association. Noelle is the first generation son of Mexican immigrants who instilled within him the value of a quality public education. He knows firsthand about the transformative power of public education and how the influence of one educator knows no limits. Cecily Mayard Cruz, a teacher, activist, and the president of the United Teachers of Los Angeles. Cecily has taught for over 27 years at both elementary and middle school levels. Most recently, she taught at the Angeles Mesa Elementary School. As the first woman of color to serve as president of the union's 51-year history, Cecily brings a social and racial justice lens to organizing for healthy, healing, and equitable public schools. We also have joining us UTLA's elementary vice president, Gloria Martinez, a national board certified teacher, yes, in special needs who holds both general and special education credentials. She has been teaching for over 17 years. As a union leader, Gloria organizes to enact policies and programs to support special needs students, their families, and the educators who serve them. We also have joining us a special educator and NEA IDEA cadre, resource cadre member, Katherine Bishop. She is also a national board certified teacher in exceptional needs. Currently, she is serving as vice president, but she has recently been elected and is now the president-elect of the Oklahoma Education Association. Katherine has been an exceptional needs educator and instructional coach for 23 years in the Putnam City Public School District in Oklahoma. Katherine, an original appointee, has served as a member of the NEA's IDEA cadre since 2000. Melina Espiritu Azacar, a parent of 2 children and activist from San Antonio, Texas, also is a special guest of ours tonight. She will lend her parent lens, her activist lens, not only for her babies, but for all of our students. So I am so excited to have you join us for this conversation. Our students are at the center of what we as educators do every single day. And we know that even before COVID-19, our students who have special needs and need those specialized supports and services have too frequently been failed by a system that refuses to adequately financially support our students and our educators in our schools. The pandemic, as we all know, has only highlighted these problems and exacerbated them for more and more of our students with disabilities. The inability to receive in-person supports has made learning even harder for them. We are so grateful to have with us Ms. Melina, a parent of a child with special needs from Texas, to talk to us tonight and share her story, her child's story. So Melina, the first question goes to you. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your child's experience has been in school, both before the pandemic as well as during the pandemic? And just talk to us a little bit about what your expectations are after the pandemic. Melina?
Thank you, Becky. I wanted to say thank you for having me here tonight. The voices of parents in the special education fight have long been forgotten, and we appreciate NEA and UTLA remembering that united with parents is the way to ensure that we get this fight won together. So thank you. My experience navigating the special education system has been frustrating, infuriating, heartbreaking. My daughter's bright, she's caring, she's artistic, and she thinks in ways that we would never ever think about in terms of, venturing towards, her thought processes. It's simply amazing all the time. But her disabilities make it very challenging for her to meet expectations of a traditional school setting. Since she entered kinder, I've had to advocate and fight for her and navigate a system that has been unjust. It's been challenging. And when my daughter had an invested teacher that went above and beyond, her year went well. And when she had a teacher that struggled a bit more or did not know how to work with her or did not have enough professional development in working with kids like my daughter, then her year was very challenging. It was difficult. I was on the phone with the school often, or on the constantly talking with them or having meetings. Middle school was an entirely different challenge for us, as it is for many parents. But for us, it meant that me and my daughter had to deal with 8 different teachers, 8 different personalities, 8 different people with varying levels of knowledge when it came to working with a child on the autism spectrum. It was a terrible struggle, and one that often ended in me intervening, my daughter devastated and overwhelmed, and me needing to contact another teacher individually or deal with another uphill battle. But then the pandemic hit. And with no guidance for teachers and everyone basically winging it, I ended up helping my daughter all day with school. From mid-March through June of the 2019-2020 school year, I had my daughter next to me while I was a full-time working parent, attempting to do my work and help her complete hers. And I just really hoped that a plan would be developed so this arrangement would get better. But nothing was put in place and no plan was developed over the summer. In July and August, I began to ask hard questions to my daughter's school. I began to push to understand the COVID emergency plan for children receiving special education services. And I kept being told that the district was still waiting for state guidance. Our district became increasingly more obsessed with the notion of learning loss and wanting to replicate the school day virtually. And I knew that there would just be absolutely no way that my daughter could navigate the school day virtually without having myself or her father sit with her all day long. And we were both and are both working full-time parents. And it just simply wasn't possible. I felt like the system was tossing us aside and the school had their hands tied since they had no direction from the state or for the district on how they would navigate servicing our students receiving special education services. My husband and I talked a ton about our options, and we kept coming back to pulling her out of school because she needed a ton of support to navigate the school day, and there was simply zero explanation on how that would happen. It was horrible. It was heartbreaking. And as a public school advocate, I felt betrayed by the state, by our district, but it came down to limited options given to us. We withdrew her from school. And we made plans to homeschool her. And it has been a very challenging time for us. But we had the ability to do this with a family of educators that could support us and could support her. But most parents don't have this option. They didn't have this option. There is a $2 billion shortfall in Texas for IDEA funding. Imagine what that money could have done to ensure that our children would have had adequate personnel, resources to ensure that they were properly serviced. As a parent, I can tell you that parents are watching. We're tired of our children not being prioritized, and we won't stand for it any longer. We expect the federal government to finally prioritize public education and finally prioritize our kids and properly fund IDEA and give our kids what they need and deserve, especially in the middle of this pandemic. So thank you for asking me how it's going, but it's definitely been a challenge, but we're here united, and I'm very happy to be here tonight.
Oh my, yeah, it's heartbreaking listening to your story, Melina, knowing that you represent so many families across our country, not just as you said during this time of the pandemic and all of those challenges, but the fight that you've had to wage throughout the life of your child. So we really appreciate that you are here this evening sharing your story, and we'll share some additional insights because your daughter is one of the 7 million reasons why we are having this discussion tonight. This is not because of a lack of effort by educators, but instead, we have elected officials who have created these color-coded barriers to equitable education opportunities, who don't understand the importance of investing in a system that will meet the needs of all of our students, and they don't believe in investing in our public schools. We know that educators know and understand what schools need to provide for those equitable opportunities, but you also raise a really good point, Melina, that we need to continue the professional development, not only for our special educators, but also for all of our educators, so that we are prepared to meet the needs of our students. But we know that the solutions will be found in the experience and professional knowledge of those who work with our students, our educators and our parents. And so we thank you for being here with us to share, to shed some light on the experience that you've had, but also, Melina, as you have been doing, you're joining us in finding that solution. So Katherine, the question is, I'm gonna shoot your way. As a special educator and a state leader, you actually bring a really interesting, broad perspective and multiple lenses to the challenges that educators have faced in meeting the needs of our students with disabilities, both before and during the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the most significant challenges have been as educators tried to, and how educators have tried to address them? And also, if you could just tell us a little bit about what you, as you talk with other educators, as you work yourself, what would you tell us that educators want and need for their students with disabilities post-pandemic?
Great. Well, thank you, President Pringle, for the question. And the best way I can answer this is to look at it in three components: the past, the present, and the future. I wish I could say that pre-pandemic that our schools were fully funded with all the resources that they could possibly need, staffed at capacity. Unfortunately, we know that was not the case. And in my 29 years in education, sadly, it has become a given that every year that Congress once again fails to meet the 40% promise of fully funding IDA. And what happens is the districts are forced to pay a higher proportion of the special education costs. And this affects, we know that now even more than ever, that it's becoming harder to recruit and retain qualified teachers. And over time, as districts are forced to put more funds into IDA to fulfill their obligations, they're unable to use those funds to increase teacher salaries, decrease class sizes, or update classroom resources. So let's shift to the present. I always like to use the analogy that during this past year, the roof of our schoolhouses have been opened up, and the issues and struggles that our students deal with every day, that they've always dealt with every day, we're given a spotlight, especially for our students with disability and their unique individualized needs. And despite the hard work, like you've heard, and the efforts of our educators to deliver special education services, some services were just more difficult or impossible to provide, especially since particular therapies or assistance required close proximity, especially if students were in remote learning. And sadly, during the pandemic, we know that many students have experienced isolation, trauma, physical and emotional abuse, homelessness. I hear it day and day from my colleagues here in Oklahoma and across the nation. And that is compounded along with the disproportionate impact on our under-resourced students and our students of color. However, let's go to the future. We have a moment in time to reflect, learn, and act as we go forward post-pandemic. That schoolhouse roof has to stay open. We have to use what we've learned to advocate for what our schools should look like and what our students truly need to be successful. We have to address and attend to the needs of the whole child, not just say it. Especially knowing that many of our students have experienced trauma, we must learn to recognize it and have staff trained to deliver trauma-informed curriculum. We have to focus on their social, emotional, and mental health needs before we can begin academics. And to accomplish this large task, it's vital that we have the staffing of our specialized instructional support personnel, our CISP, to help provide that full complement of programs and related services. now is the time, as Melina said, that we have to fully fund the 40% promise of IDA, and we have to utilize the funds of the American Rescue Plan to help provide high quality resources to assist our students with disabilities so that they can thrive and be successful. And Becky, as I close, what educators want and need right now is to have a seat at the table, to have a voice at the table for what their students need. They know what we need to do going forward, and that's what we need to be doing.
Oh my, Catherine, I certainly could not agree more that we know and have known, right? The resources that are needed. And we're at a moment, I've been saying this a lot to a lot of people, that we are at a moment where we have the opportunity to tap into those resources. We know that in the American Rescue Plan, that significant funding has been allocated to public education in general, but specifically focus on special education. It certainly is not getting us to that 40% that you talked about, but it's closer than we've been in decades. And so it is our responsibility as educators and activists to ensure that we are not just at the table, but we are having influence in the decisions that are being made about how to spend that money in the best interests of our students and our schools. So thank you so much for that, Catherine. I will tell you that we know that because we've been fighting for full funding of IDA for forever. We know that it's not only the resources, and it's a lot of people just think about that in terms of, if we just give more money, then that'll solve all the problems. But here's the thing, it does take resources to ensure that we have class sizes so that our students' individual needs can be met. It does take resources to make sure that we have those special supports that our students with disabilities need, that they get them. It does take resources to have the kind of professional development that you talked about, Catherine. And so we have to be prepared to tap into those resources in a way that meets the needs for all of our students. Cecily, I'm going to go to you next. When most people think of special education and they think of IDA and specialized instruction and services, they don't always think about the fact that that we also have a requirement, a federal requirement in the federal law, which you're very familiar with, Section 405 of the Rehabilitation Act, which says that schools must provide supports and services to those 504 only students, as well as our students with special needs, which includes students with asthma and diabetes, ADHD, anxiety disorders, trauma-related issues, and others who may need mental, behavioral, and health services. So Cecily, the Fulfill the Promise Coalition, made up of our local affiliates across the country, recently commissioned a report from Dan Nosen of the Civil Rights Project in UCLA on special education and 504 only students. Can you talk just a little bit about why the coalition commissioned this report and some of the report's findings, especially as they relate to racial inequality? Cecily?
Thank you, President Pringle, and I'm glad to be here with all of you today. Yes, UTLA has had a long history of activism around special education, speaking up on this, as well as working to remedy historic underfunding and the actual needs that our students deserve. Students of color in less resource districts experience the worst impacts. We know that to be true. And so you can see that impact of racial inequality in special education with who receives services and what types of services those are. In this report, the UCLA report, Disabling Inequality, it found that thousands of school districts across the country did not identify a single 504 only student, which is pretty incredible. Children of color are less likely to be identified for 504 only services than their white student counterparts. The report also found that students with disabilities also disproportionately suffer from exclusionary, sometimes punitive discipline, which we all know leads our babies into the school to prison pipeline, particularly our students of color with disabilities. This report commissioned is to provide guidance and to support the advocacy so needed on special education as we recover from this pandemic. We cannot forget the needs of students with disabilities, especially students of color with disabilities, which is why we started the Fulfill the Promise campaign, whose first action was filing a petition with the US Department of Education seeking guidance.
So, Cecily, thank you so much. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that you have done later, but it is absolutely essential that in your role as a union leader, that you are talking about exactly what it is our students need and what they deserve, and being explicit in the racial disparities that exist in our schools and in our communities, and ensuring that we demand that what our students must have, so they can, as I often say, live into their brilliance. That you, UTLA, and you're not going to do it by yourself, that you've done that. You've reached out to community members, to parents, to academics, to help make your case. And I have no doubt, Cecily, that you're not going to stop. You're going to continue to do the incredible work that you have been doing, and you will continue to mount that effort throughout this country, so that we can finally get for our students what we know they so deserve. So let's move now to our Secretary Treasurer, Mr. Noel Candelaria. Noel, you've heard from your fellow panelists, and you not only are, of course, a special education teacher, but now as the Secretary Treasurer of the largest labor union in this country. You know how hard our members have been working, sending thousands of messages, making phone calls to their legislators, advocating for the kinds of resources that we know they need and they deserve. And finally, because of those efforts, the President Biden, of course, put forward the American Rescue Plan, and it was passed. And that is due to the unrelenting advocacy of educators and parents and community members, allies all over this country. So Noel, I want you to talk a little bit about what the American Rescue Plan is and what it does differently, really honestly, Noel, than stimulus plans from the past, and how it can benefit most especially our students with disabilities. Noel?
Thank you, President Pringle, and it's great to hear, my fellow panelists and the passion that they have for this work. And, listening to Melina, speak, brought me right back to the parents I work with in the classroom, and the partnership and that important relationship, and how important it was because we both wanted what was best, for our students and for their children. And, when they walked into my classroom, they became my children. And so I really appreciate Melina being on here. And when we talk about the American Rescue Plan, it's the third of the stimulus packages. But like you said, this one is substantially different because it actually puts in place not only resources, but effective measures to keep students and educators safe, which we've been advocating since last May, to ensure that our students are safe first and foremost. But it also makes an extraordinary investment that is lifting countless of children and families out of poverty and is working to address the immense inequities that have systemically affected the most vulnerable students, including our students with disabilities and our communities of color. For decades, we have experienced firsthand the impact of not investing substantially in our public schools, but especially for our students in special education. And so when we think about what the American Rescue Plan does for students with disabilities, there are two very important components. One is a $3 billion one-time supplemental fund for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which, like you mentioned, we've been fighting for full funding since its inception. And this is bringing us one step closer. Even though it is one-time money, it is going to be critical for our districts and instrumental to help us, and help our districts meet the needs of our infants, that are part of that system, the toddlers, preschoolers, and our K-12 population, because we know that it costs more money to educate students with disabilities. I always think about a student that I had, and the occupational therapist, the physical therapist, and all of the support professionals that we needed to make sure that my student had the best opportunity to fulfill their own individual potential. And so this money is intended to help our schools recover from the impact of this pandemic. But there's also a much bigger pool of resources and money with this American Rescue Plan, which is $122 billion for the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, which we always like to use, acronyms and jargon, but we often hear that referred to as ESSER funds, right? And so the Department of Education has been very clear with these funds that they can and should be used on student populations that have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, including helping our students with disabilities, students of color, students from under-resourced communities, our English language learners, as well as students experiencing homelessness. And when I think about the students that I served, that I had the pleasure of working with, there was so much intersectionality between all of those for a lot of my students. And so we know that our students with disabilities have many needs that must be addressed. And these ESSER funds can help provide the needed resources to address the social and emotional supports, the lost learning time, because we know how many of our students with special education, like Melina described for her daughter, weren't able to get the services that they so desperately needed to help them just connect and succeed, while so many of their peers were still moving along. And sadly, this pandemic related trauma that a lot of our students have experienced because, whether they lost a loved one or maybe even a fellow student, the isolation, the hunger, domestic violence, or the stresses related because of the loss of income. We now have an opportunity with this influx of resources to truly begin laying that foundation to make up for that lost time. And I think what's really important about with the American Rescue Plan is that it makes sure that our students and our parents and our educators, especially our union members, are part of the district's developing a plan on how to be able to best meet the needs of our students, which is something that we've called for. And when we look at how our school districts have to use these funds to be able to recover the learning that we know, our students have had the great need for. And so, this is a tremendous opportunity in what President Biden has provided to set the strong foundation of the work that is still ahead of us, to not only help us meet the challenges that this pandemic presented for our students and students with disabilities, but the work that we have ahead of us, both as parents and as educators in our communities, working together to make sure that that this is not just a one-time influx of resources that are desperately needed, but that we are laying the foundation for the resources that are going to be needed moving forward. Because like my sister Katherine said, this was there before the pandemic. And so, we need to be able to now take this opportunity, this once in a lifetime opportunity, but not make it a once in a lifetime opportunity. Make it something that is going to truly lay and pave the road for what we know is desperately needed in our schools for our children, for our students, and for the educators to be able to really help our students fulfill their own potential.
Thank you so much, Noel. You're absolutely correct. This is historic legislation, historic funding that the level at which will lift half of our students out of poverty. And Secretary Cardona, in issuing guidance to our local education associations and state education associations, it was very explicit that in developing plans for spending that money, that those agencies must involve stakeholders, and specifically called out educators and their unions, the organizations that represent them. So it is absolutely essential that we are part, and our parents, our communities are part of making sure that that money is spent in ways that will actually benefit our students in our schools. So we heard earlier from Cecily about the groundbreaking report on special education that has been used to support the Fulfill the Promise campaign that she talked about, and a petition that was recently filed with the U.S. Department of Education, seeking guidance. So Gloria, this kind of question is going to come to you. Can you please tell us a little bit more about the Fulfill the Promise campaign and that petition that I referenced just now? That is a nationwide coalition of local affiliates and parents and educators who filed that petition with the U.S. Department of Education. Gloria?
Yes, thank you, Madam President. So when we began trying to address how to serve students with disabilities during a pandemic, we could not ignore the fact that communities of color were disproportionately affected by COVID. We knew that our communities of color were facing a triple pandemic, COVID, racism, and capitalism. And we knew that our students with disabilities would not be immune. And we knew that we had to do something and that it had to be big. So we began reaching out to locals we had worked with, parent leaders, that led us to parent leaders, as well as having conversations with disability advocacy groups. This resulted in a never before seen coalition comprised of parents, teacher unions, advocacy groups, and academics. Our locals include Austin, Boston, Madison, Milwaukee, Oakland, and of course, Los Angeles. I have to give them some major recognition because they've been parents from those locals, as well as Melina from San Antonio, and parents and educators from Juneau, Alaska. Our coalition also includes what this coalition did, what was so impactful about this coalition is how much we all needed this space to connect. Parents, educators, advocates, attorneys, and unions needed a space where we can address some of our differences, but more importantly, find common ground. Mm-hmm. And that common ground includes funding IDEA at the promise of 40%, which we've heard others reference, and the need for 504 funding, oversight, as well as guidance on how to serve our students post-pandemic. Our petition and our expert report is already making an impact, and it's because of this national coalition. No single local would have able this much attention on its own, but together it makes it really difficult to ignore. I'd like to review just a few of the key remedies we are seeking in the petition. We're seeking guidance, as you mentioned, specifically to address special education inequities, compliant investigators to review data and information for evidence of systemic discrimination, guidance on best practices for serving students with disabilities who are also English language learners, how to address implicit bias. We talked about the professional development, how we strive for more multicultural competency and implement restorative justice trainings to develop appropriate response plans. Furthermore, states and districts need guidance that will ensure those ARP funds that we're talking about are spent in equitable ways that will assist students with disabilities. And these are just a few, considering all that our youth has and will face has and will overcome. We also seek guidance to address trauma and meet the social emotional needs of our students, including failure to comply with Section 504. Cecily mentioned the need, right? The thousands of districts who have gone without identifying a 504 only student, and making sure that this disparate impact violation is able to be discovered under anti-discriminatory law. We cannot stress enough how now is the time to invest in community-based mental health services. COVID-19 has shed a nasty but necessary spotlight, Katherine spoke of it earlier, on two of the many unstated pandemics that so many of us face daily, racism and ableism. And this coalition is proud to have a role in that crucial advocacy work. And if I'm allowed, I like to just, a shameless plug for those who wish to learn more about our petition. You can visit our website, www.fulfillthepromise.net, and they can also sign on to our petition and help us reach our goal of 25,000 signatures.
Thank you, Gloria. That's not a shameless plug. That is a proud plug. You should be proud of the work you have helped to lead, and what you share with us. The coalition on fulfilling the promise to our students with disabilities. You're demonstrating how important it is to have that collective action. And we really appreciate you sharing that you approached it from a place of bringing folks together and understanding that there were some differences, but you had to work toward that common goal of ensuring our kids get what they need. So we really appreciate you sharing that you took that approach in forming your coalition. So we have lots of questions from our audience members. So we're going to try to get through as many as we possibly can. Our first question is from Susan. She's an ESP, an education support professional, one of our educators, who asked this question. We hear so much about equity, but parents who struggle to read or understand their parental rights are unable to effectively advocate for their children. So that necessarily means the children with wealthier parents or parents who are better advocates get more than those children whose parents struggle to be those kinds of advocates. How can we ensure that all kids get all the supports they need, and not just the kids who have advantaged families? Melina, I'm going to go to you first on that one. Gloria, I'm going to come to you after. Melina?
Thank you. Sure. Well, what I can say is we need an equitable system that prioritizes kids. We need funding. And as I stated before, Texas is in a $2 billion shortfall, and we need these funds to ensure that our children get equal access to accommodations, programs, personnel, licensed counselors, licensed social workers, and advocates that can help guide and assist parents. We need more. We can't ensure equity with the current system in place. The federal government promised to fund IDEA, and we need them to hold to that promise and finally provide the funding needed to ensure equity. We cannot allow the systematic discrimination that has occurred with students of color for years. We must do better. We must all imagine that each child is our own, and remember, we would do anything for our own child. We need to value and empower all parents, and especially families of color, and we must all stand tall and united and together to fight this battle. Our children will not be ignored. And I can tell you tonight that I have the spirit of all the other mothers standing united in our coalition. And we're going to say that we will not stop fighting for the rights of our kids and all the other kids that come after our own. So I hope I answer that to the best of the ability that I can, but I think you said to throw it over to Gloria, so I will do that.
Gloria?
Yeah, thank you, Melina. That's definitely something to build off of. Thank you for saying that so beautifully. And yes, our parents in this coalition, and parents, I think that we've all worked with, embody the spirit that Melina speaks of. So, one of the things that I think is really important is to just call out is that any child that has a service is because they are deserving, right? Is because they need that service. What we believe is necessary is that we believe, aside from the funding, is that resources should be available for those who need it. And it shouldn't take someone who dominates the English language, someone who brings an advocate or has access to attorneys, right? That they're the ones that have access. That is too much to ask for a parent, right, to have to go through hoops. So we want to make sure that, you know, all kids get support. And that starts with making sure that districts across the country don't have to make up for that, for the underfunding of IDEA, right? Katherine mentioned it, and so did Melina. Here in just in LAUSD alone, we have a shortcoming that we have, that our district has to make up for. And it impacts, right? It impacts the services that are available. It also impacts the general education fund. So we believe that it starts with funding, but we also believe that that funding also requires oversight. We also believe that we have to go, you know, and do more of the outreach, include more professional development, and find ways to communicate, find ways to bring all stakeholders to the table to ensure that those individual needs are met.
Thank you, Gloria. Absolutely. And, you know, equity means that every student gets what they need. And it should not be dependent on whether they have an advocate. We have that responsibility. It is about that promise, right? And Melina, our children will not be denied. You know, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So we have another question from Felicia, who's hails from Nebraska. And she asks, how can we act to ensure intersectional needs are met accurately and equitably? Katherine, I'm going to go to you for that question.
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Felicia, and for raising such an important issue. We have to acknowledge that our students in our schools can belong to more than one marginalized group, and that adverse experiences such as homelessness, foster care, juvenile justice often disproportionately affect students who are economically disadvantaged, students of color, English language learners, and our students with disabilities. And those adverse experiences create barriers to access and participate in the programs and services. And so for speaking for educators, what we need, it's vital that our educators, and I'm talking school administrators, teachers, support professionals, have the needed professional and personal learning to be able to identify a student's unique needs and who they are. And that professional learning has to come with multiple things. It has to come with resources. It has to come with funding, but most importantly, it has to come with time. It has to come with time to be able to participate fully in that professional learning, because our educators, they need the opportunity to continuously engage, practice, and reflect, and repeat, engage, practice, and reflect in that learning. And by providing those professional supports, that will help our educators in schools to support and nurture our students and their needs and their differences that they have. And so this is such an important topic and needs to be continued to be up front and center.
Thank you so much, Katherine. You absolutely are correct. No question. We have a question from a retired educator, Mary, from California. She and many others actually asked the same question. What will it take to fully fund IDEA? Noelle, I'm going to kick that to you.
Oh, I will reiterate the famous words of our current vice president of the National Education Association, which is organize, organize, organize.
Right?
You know, it's really going to take, you know, all of us in every community across this nation, organizing together with our parents, with our business community, everybody we can, to make sure we're electing, you know, people in positions of authority that are allocating resources for our schools and for our students. That begins at the school board level, to the state level, to the national level. You know, Melina talked about in Texas, you know, there's a $2 billion shortfall for special education. But when we think about at the federal level and what Congress has in front of them right now, which is a Keep Our PACT Act, right, which is a mandatory 10-year path to fully funding both Title I and the Every Student Succeeds Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is part of what President Biden ran on. He ran on, you know, putting together a 10-year plan to fully fund, you know, IDEA, which, you know, we talked about when Congress first passed. They promised to pay 40% of that excess cost of special education services. It's currently funded at 14%. That's a huge, huge gap that is that is impacting so many of our students and so many budgets in our districts, when they're having to stretch their budgets and constantly being forced to try to do more with less. And we know that's not possible. We've been trying to do more with less for decades, and it is not working, and it is impacting so many of our students, especially our students with disabilities. And we've seen what it's done to educators and the high turnover that we have in our special education classrooms, because our teachers are burning out, our paraprofessionals are burning out. And so we have to organize in every community, in every election. It's going to take political will and the political power of the community and the grassroots to demand from their elected leaders, not only that they talk about, when it comes to election, everybody says, oh, we're all for the kids. But then we forget about the kids, and we forget about the educators who work with our kids when it comes time to actually voting to allocate the dollars and the resources necessary to help our schools and our educators meet the needs of every single student, to so that our students, we can see them actually fulfill their own individual potential. And so it's going to take us organizing around the clock, year round, because it just doesn't stop with the election. It stops with holding them accountable once they're in office, because there's going to be the next election cycle that we have to make sure that if they're not doing their job, then just like we put them in office, we will take them out of office and put someone that will actually do what's right for kids and do what's right for our public schools.
Thank you, Noel. So we're going to organize, and then organize some more. Thank you. Absolutely. Cecily, I'm going to come to you with this question, because actually we had a lot of audience members that asked the same question in different kind of ways. But I know this is work that is near and dear to your heart, and so I want to throw this one your way. We had many of our audience members, including Andrea, an educator, and Linda, a parent, asked about the recruitment and retention of special education educators. Can you talk a little bit about the issue of recruitment and retention of educators in special education? And specifically, Cecily, can you talk about some of the challenges and maybe even some solutions about recruiting and retaining our educators of color, special educators of color?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that question. I think the overarching piece is to have as many educators as possible teaching our babies. So that's just point blank. We've got to have that. Coming into this now teacher shortage, folks are going to be scrambling. So I'm going to say we're going to need to incentivize going into teacher prep colleges and actually recruiting folks from there that are going to be special educators, and incentivize that. Districts around the country are going to need to look for more creative solutions, and those are creative solutions trying to bring folks into the profession, as we have a mass exodus of folks retiring like we do every year. Talking about recruiting and retaining educators of color, that has been something, I think it's like a mystery to every single district around the country. We need to actually jump into HBCUs and I think they're Hispanic serving institutions as well, so that we can actually bring in folks. But I'm going to say something pretty radical. I would say we need to do educator prep starting when folks are in high school. Actually talking about how we bring folks into our profession to build up our profession. And that is the only way we're going to do that, is we're looking at our students who I don't say are the future, they're the now. And so why not talk about all the beautiful ways that folks can actually change lives. And we know as educators sitting here, and of course we have a beautiful parent here as well, representing all the parents. We know that educators can change lives every day. And so if that is the case and the mission and what we are trying to do, then that is exactly the goal. So we need to reach down and talk specifically to high school students, getting them involved, going to teacher prep programs, going to colleges, going to all of these different locations and actually saying, embracing our communities and saying, come back to this very school, come back to your neighborhood. That's why community schools are so important, to bring in the next generation of educators, especially educators of color, who will focus and demand the changes that Melina spoke about before. We have got to do this. This is on behalf of our babies across the country.
Thank you so much, Cecily. And I know that as you have done this work, that the retention of our special educators, especially, and certainly our special educators of color, require that we support them in their work and we give them what they need, the tools and the support they need to do the jobs that they love. I don't know if you can do this, Gloria, in about 2 sentences, but this last question comes from an educator in California, and she wants to know, how will teaching maybe be different post-pandemic, especially when we're thinking about our students with disabilities, or how do you hope it will be different?
Yeah, well, 2 sentences. Okay. I hope it's more empathetic. How's that? I hope that now that we've been afforded the grand opportunity to be invited into our students' homes, that we not only understand them, but we learn from that experience. We realize that everyone has struggles that they had to overcome during this pandemic. We hopefully learn what I hope most of us globally learned, is that we are stronger when we act as one, that we are stronger when we act out of love and are not, selfish, because sometimes it takes all of our individual actions for the betterment of society, right? So I hope that when we return to teaching and return to the normal, right, that we are more empathetic, because we understand, the struggles that we all went through the same struggle. We were all lonely. We were all, struggling at times. We were all trying to, find ways to find hope, right? And that's one of the things teachers do. Like we invest in hope, right? The kindergarten teacher, the preschool teacher teaches the ABCs in hopes that one day that child will fill out a college application or a job application to their dreams, right? So I hope that is, it's maybe they were looking for something more tangible, like, we were going to use more computers, or we're going to do more online. But what I'm hoping is, to really connect with our students like we never have before, because that's one thing the pandemic has taught us, is that we're all interconnected.
Oh, thank you so much, Gloria. That's a perfect way to end. Invest in hope. I love that. I love that. As we draw to a close, let me share this. One does not fight to influence change and then leave that change to someone else to bring about. Civil rights activist Kwame Ture spoke those words almost 6 decades ago. As we live through these times of so much change, these times that have been so hard and scary and exhausting, his words are absolutely relevant to this day. And our UTLA leaders, Cecily and Gloria, and the allies that you have tapped across this country have worked to influence the change. By filing the petition that you shared with us with the Department of Education, so we can strengthen those guidelines, we can shed the light on addressing the negative impact that underfunding of our students with disabilities has had on generations of students and their families, and how this pandemic has exacerbated all of that. So I just want to say thank you for stepping up and taking action for our students and for our educators, for our schools, for our parents, for our communities. Thank you. Thank you for being the strong and unrelenting advocates that you are. Thank you all for joining us, Noelle and Melina and Catherine, all of you for joining us this evening, and for you all stepping up and taking action. And for those who have joined us this evening, we need you to do that too. So I'm asking that you take action in this moment. You need to make sure that all of our students have the opportunity to learn in supportive environments that respects their and sees their humanity, their dignity, and responds appropriately to the needs that they bring with them to our schools. That you fight to ensure that Congress finally fulfills its promise for full funding of IDEA, that you make sure that you are not only at the table, but you are influencing the change that can happen with these funds coming, significant funds coming from the American Rescue Plan, so that our underserved populations that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 will get what they so need and they so deserve. Thank you. Thank you all for the work that you do every day to ensure that every one of us, everyone, is worthy of our students. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for all you will do for our students and for our educators and for our schools.